When I was a young wrestling fan, let's say the years from about 1992 to 1998, there were 4 wrestling pay-per-views, 4 annual events that I had to watch every year. I refused to miss them. They were the Royal Rumble, because I love the Royal Rumble match, WrestleMania, because it was the biggest show of the year, SummerSlam, because my first pay-per-view ever was SummerSlam 91, so I felt a special connection to that annual event. And number 4 on that list was a WCW pay-per-view, Halloween Havoc. I've always loved Halloween. I like monsters and horror and all that other good stuff. So the idea of a Halloween-themed wrestling pay-per-view immediately captured my attention. The first one I watched was in 1992, because not only was I getting into WCW thanks to the Sting and Vader matches, but I found out they have a Halloween-themed pay-per-view. That's awesome. And then the first main event for the first Halloween Havoc that I ever saw had Jake the Snake Roberts, one of my favorite wrestling characters, and a perfect character to spotlight in a Halloween-themed pay-per-view. So I was all on board for that event, and I was excited for that show. I was excited to watch specifically the Sting's Jake Roberts match. And Halloween Havoc from that point forward became one of my must-watches every year for annual wrestling events. Didn't matter how bad the product was. It didn't matter even really what the card was. I had to see Halloween Havoc. Now, I remember reading an article. It might have been on the WrestleCrap website, but don't quote me on it. That said something to the effect of Halloween Havoc was always a bad show. There was never a good one. And having gone back and rewatched all of the Halloween Havoc events, I can tell you, I can truthfully say, a lot of them weren't very good. They don't hold up to modern-day scrutiny in a lot of ways, and a lot of my appreciation for it came from having more of a childish mindset and being more accepting of the things that I was given. But there were good Halloween Havoc events, and there were really good Halloween Havoc matches and moments that I definitely want to highlight. So, in the spirit of Halloween Havoc's history, both the good and the bad, I'm going to rank all of the Halloween Havoc events from worst to best and cover all the things that I both admired about the Halloween Havoc shows and what I didn't like about them, and give you a full-on worst to best of that particular event. Now, this will only be counting the WCW annual Halloween Havoc events. I will not be counting the NXT ones because A, I've never seen them, and B, I don't care. It's like, NXT is a dead brand to me, and I really don't give a crap about it, so I have no interest in going back and watching their Halloween Havoc events, because it feels like, to me, it's one of my... something that WWE does that kind of irks me, where they spend so long crapping on WCW, you're just burying it in the dirt and kicking the dead horse while it was down. And now that it's convenient that there is some nostalgic, feelings for WCW, they feel the need to ape their names and use their pay-per-view names and things like that. Use those old WCW traditions to try and generate interest, which to me is kind of hypocritical. Whatever. It's like, I know it's wrestling, I know, but I have I don't know. I get a little irked when they do things like that, and the NXT Halloween Havocs are one of those things in my mind. So, with all of that said, let's go ahead and get started, and let's start with number 12. Now, I've said many times before that 1999 was when WCW truly died for me. It was when their creative just fell off a cliff and everything was bad. It was like they just could not do anything right. 2000, they were basically just a zombie version of what they had been before. And while things did get really, really bad in 2000, I don't consider 2000 as a whole to be as bad as 1999, because 1999 was where they killed all the goodwill, at least with me. That said, if I had to pick a worst Halloween Havoc event, I'm gonna go with 2000, because that was when the corpse of WCW was just pummeled, battered, bruised, and then officially buried. And the fact that this is the final Halloween Havoc show kind of leaves a sour taste in my mouth. And it's really sad, because, you try to explain WCW in 2000 to anybody who didn't experience it, and it's almost impossible to cover all of the wacky crap that happened during that year. But, in particular, this Halloween Havoc event, it is filled to the brim with pointless matches, bad gimmicks and almost no intrigue. I mean, some guys tried, like Booker T and Scott Steiner, who are really like some of the few good things that WCW had going during this time. They tried because they were in the title match, and they tried to make it work, but the show as a whole, very little of it actually landed. I think the most memorable thing on the entire show was the Sting versus Jeff Jarrett match, and it wasn't memorable for being a really good match or very creative or anything. It was a wild dog and pony show where Jarrett brought out an army of fake Stings. I think Bill Eadie was one of them. I think Chris Harris was another one, and it was again more of a dog and pony show rather than anything fun, exciting, or anything worthy of the Halloween Havoc name. And again, not to belabor a point, but if I met WCW in 1999 with annoyance, anger, and just disdain, I met it in 2000 with this depressed resignation that it's never going to get better. And shows like Halloween Havoc 2000 only cemented the fact, man, WCW is never going to recover from this. And they did not, very sadly. At number 11, we have 1999. Now, I've already talked about how bad WCW got in 1999, where it went from the hottest wrestling show on TV just a few years earlier to just cratering like nothing I've ever seen before, so fast. And it was clear, you look at the Monday Night Wars in 1999, it was clear who the winner was. And WWF, they made a lot of mistakes creatively in 99 as well, but none that were as damaging as the ones that WCW made. When you look at the Finger Poke of Doom and the whole fiasco that went on that night, and killing off Goldberg, and the NWO becoming a directionless mess, and bringing back red and yellow Hulk Hogan purely out of desperation to try and generate some kind of interest. It was a bad time to be a WCW fan, and that lack of momentum carried them into Halloween Havoc 1999, the first WCW pay-per-view headed by Vince Russo, a very controversial figure in the world of professional wrestling. And I've given Russo credit in the past. I think he is a large reason why the WWF found its momentum and found its footing in the Monday Night Wars period. And I think he does deserve credit for that. But I've also said I don't think he can be the sole creative voice involved in putting together a wrestling show, because then you get WCW in 2000 and you see what a mess that is. And I think Halloween Havoc 99 is a show that showcases some of Russo's worst tendencies. Like the very confusing situation with the World Heavyweight Championship involving Sting, Hogan, and Goldberg. First of all, Sting as a heel didn't work, never worked, should have never been tried. Well, I guess you don't know it can't work unless you try it. So maybe I can understand the desire to try it, but that whole confusing scenario just didn't work, made the show frustrating and confusing, and ultimately. And it ended up meaning absolutely nothing by the time that the show was over anyway. So if you look at the next night on Nitro. So the whole thing involving the WCW title was just a mess. And there was very little compensating to make up for that whole confusing scenario. The only thing that did, and the only thing that raises the 1999 event above the number 12 spot, the worst spot, worst Halloween Havoc of all time, is the United States title match between Goldberg and Sid. A awesome match, a nice, stiff, two heavyweights just beating the crap out of each other showcase. It was bloody, it was violent, it was brutal, and it was awesome. It was absolutely the biggest highlight on a show that was desperate for highlights. So it goes to show that while WCW was really, really falling off a cliff at this point, they did have some highlights, and that Goldberg-Sid match I think is worth going out of your way to see, because it was an awesome one to watch, especially if you're like me and you do like to watch big guys just clobber each other. I think this is an excellent example of that from two guys who weren't known for having great matches. So, if anybody ever says, it's like, oh, what's Sid's best match? What's Goldberg's best match? I'm like, yeah, you got that Halloween Havoc 99 match as a contender for both of them, at least. So, again, that's the sole highlight on an otherwise pretty worthless show. Number 10, we have 1995. This show is legendary in how bad it is. I mean, the yate alone is a moment that will tickle the funny bone of any wrestling fan who remembers it. It is just one of those unbelievably stupid moments that just lives forever in our collective consciousness as wrestling fans. It is absolutely amazing. I wish I could say that was the only stupid thing that happened on this show, but it is not. We also got the infamous Hulk Hogan versus the Giant monster truck battle, which is way less cool than it sounded, which ended with the Giant getting pushed off the top of a building, and yet somehow returning for the main event match with Hogan completely unscathed. And then Hogan, first of all, the match ended in a schmoz where it just got thrown out. It confused everyone. And then later on, they announced that Hulk Hogan was disqualified, and there was a clause in the contract where if he got disqualified, he would lose the title. It was an absolute mess of a show that, again, very little compensating to make up for the fact that there was all this stupidness going on, but it's not like the undercard was that great either. You also had Ric Flair tagging with Sting and betraying him again. I mean, Ric Flair betrayed Sting so many times, I lost track of it. So to have it happen again here in 95 was almost eye-roll inducing. The show is pretty bad. The show is pretty bad. So what keeps it from being lower on the list above 99 and 2000? Well, in my opinion, the stuff with the Yeti, the Yeti, the Hogan Giant stuff, the monster truck stuff, it's all so ridiculous and so silly. At least it's funny bad. I'll at least credit it for being funny bad. Like, I think of the, 99 and 2000 and I get sad and angry. 1995 makes me laugh, and that's that's more of a positive emotion, right? So 1995, it gets bumped up a little higher on the list by virtue of the fact that at least it's funny. I will give it that. And at number 9, we have Halloween Havoc 1994. At this point, Hulkamania had come to WCW, and it felt like a big deal initially, especially when you look at Bash at the Beach from earlier that year, the biggest WCW pay-per-view by far up to that point. Unfortunately, a few months later, it felt like the magic had kind of faded a little bit, and WCW had kind of devolved into a low-rent version of what WWF was just a few years earlier in the 1980s. You had Hacksaw Jim Duggan getting a U.S. title shot, you had the Nasty Boys as a main fixture of the show, you had the Honky Tonk Man and a TV title match, and the Big Boss Man under the Guardian Angel gimmick wrestling on the show as well. So they brought in all these ex-WWF guys, and it just kind of looked like an inferior version of what the WWF was during its glory days in the 1980s. So it didn't really work. It didn't help that the match quality overall was pretty poor, especially when you look at the battle between Dave Sullivan and Kevin Sullivan. That one was not particularly great, but it did have a major main event, and that was Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair in a steel cage match with both men's careers on the line. A rematch from their Bash at the Beach encounter and their Clash of Champions encounter over the summer. And you had Mr. T as the special guest referee. You had Sherry getting involved, and whenever Sherry's involved in a steel cage match, she's going to take bumps because she was insane. The match itself was okay. I don't think it's anywhere near what they did at Bash at the Beach. And I'm also not the biggest fan of the Hogan-Flair matches, their series as a whole. It almost felt like this match was treated as more of a joke. And to me, it's like it's a battle with the legendary careers of two larger-than-life icons on the line, and I feel like the match should have been treated a little bit more seriously without less of the dog and pony show aspect of it. But this was also the show that revealed who the Masked Man was that was attacking Hulk Hogan, and it was Brother Brudai, Brutus the Barber Beefcake, setting up a Starrcade main event that absolutely no one wanted. So it was clear at this point, well, I'm not going to sit here and say it's the worst show of all time or anything like that. It was clear at this point that, like, the Hulkamania magic was kind of fading a little bit, and they needed to do something new and dynamic with Hogan, which they tried initially with the Dungeon and Doom stuff, and they had Hogan go to the dark side and wear all black and things, and that didn't really work either. It wasn't until he became Hollywood Hulk Hogan with the NWO that Hogan really found his traction in WCW. 1994's Halloween Havoc, it's not the most offensive thing I've ever watched. It's just not a very exciting show overall, which is disappointing considering who was in the main event and what was on the line. At number 8, we have 1991. Now, this might be strange to say, but I feel like the 91 Halloween Havoc is kind of where Halloween Havoc as an event found its identity. The Halloween theme was a lot more present on this show than it had been at the previous events. And you had the laughably ridiculous Chamber of Horrors match, which had a wide variety of Hall of Fame caliber talents. You had Sting, you had Vader, you had Mick Foley, you had the Steiner brothers, you had Scott Hall, you had Abdullah the Butcher, and you had El Gigante, but, whatever. But you stuck, mostly great talents in this weird cage match that was absolutely ridiculous, where you had to stick one of your opponents in the electric chair and flip the switch, and that was going to kill them, I guess. Poor Abdullah had to be the one in the chair at the end of the match, but... the match was so cartoonish and so ridiculous. It's probably my favorite so bad it's good match of all time. It's so silly. I just get a kick out of watching it every single time. There aren't a lot of those, by the way, in wrestling history. There aren't a lot of so bad they're good matches. I think this one is a so bad it's good match because it's just so baffling. You have all these great talents and you stick them in this ridiculous match. I don't understand it. I still don't understand it. I don't understand why it opened up the card, quite honestly. But on this show, you also had two jobbers named the Creatures, again fitting in with the Halloween theme. You had Kevin Nash wrestling as Oz on pay-per-view. I'm sure he's proud of that one. Rick Rude made his WCW debut, being unmasked as the WCW Halloween Phantom, which was actually a pretty good angle once you get the reveal of who it was under the mask. It was all of these kind of like over-the-top Halloween style and themed antics that gave the show somewhat of a personality. While a lot of it was silly and while a lot of it was stupid, there was like this, it gave Halloween Havoc like that unique flavor that set it apart from all the other wrestling events. So what maybe it lacked in quality, it made up for in flavor, kind of like what I've said about WrestleMania 9, where people crap on that show, but it's like, yeah, but the Roman look kind of looked cool to me. Like, I like the pageantry of it. I think that's what 91 had. It had some pageantry to it that set it apart from other events. So what it lacked in ring quality, it made up for in being colorful and having some fun visuals throughout. Now, as far as good wrestling goes, there actually were some good matches. You had Terry Taylor taking on Bobby Eaton in a solid match. There was Steve Austin taking on Dustin Rhodes in a solid match. And the title match of Lex Luger and Ron Simmons in a 2 out of 3 falls match, actually surprisingly solid. You wouldn't think that Lex Luger and Ron Simmons would mesh together all that well, but they had a pretty good match. So there was some good stuff on the show with all the other cartoony antics going on. There was some good stuff. So, like I said, I feel like the 91 event did at least give an identity to Halloween Havoc as an annual event. Whether or not that's a good thing, I'll leave that up to you. And at number 7, we have 1992's Halloween Havoc. Spin the wheel, make the deal. That whole concept of spinning a wheel to determine the match stipulation for the main event was such a unique concept, and the line spin the wheel, make the deal is so closely tied with Halloween Havoc's history, it actually surprises me that they only did it twice. Like, you'd think that they did that every single year for Halloween Havoc, the way people kind of remember that whole concept. And honestly, for all the stupid ideas that WCW had over the years, like, spin the wheel, make the deal is actually kind of a cool one where you don't know what type of match you're going to get until you order the pay-per-view, and the babyface has to basically determine their own fate by spinning the wheel and making the deal. And I thought the whole concept was really cool. And this was also one of the earliest examples of using cinematics to kind of hype a match. Not doing a cinematic match, but using kind of a more, like a heightened production to create like some kind of build-up for these matches. And this is where you get the segments of Sting meeting up with Jake Roberts in a bar, and they do these things for the Halloween Havoc commercials and things like. And Jake Roberts is such a great performer that he made those segments work and work really well. So I think there's a lot of flavoring around the 1992 event that really made it exciting, especially for me as a first-time viewer of Halloween Havoc. I was fully on board with this concept. And I wish they'd kept Spin the Wheel, Make the Deal around. I think this would have been a great annual thing to do every year for them. I mean, they did War Games every year, and that's a hard match to do every year because you got to justify involving 8 people in one conflict. So this one's easy. You just have a big feud, and then you pick the one that gets the wheel. I mean, that's an easy one to do. But I think my biggest knock on them on using it in 1992 was that for the Jake and Sting match, they went with possibly the most boring match on the list, which was the Coal Miner's Glove match. Now, okay, look, the Coal Miner's Glove, yes, it can be used as a weapon because it has the metal bar going across the thing and everything, but I think most people who aren't involved in the blue-collar work industries understand what a coal miner's glove is. So a kid like me was completely confused. Like, I don't know, why is a glove a weapon? I don't get it. So that's a hard thing to kind of convey for people who aren't familiar with how coal miner gloves actually work. And I think maybe they could have renamed it into something else or made it more well-defined, but in any case, picking the Coal Miner's Glove match for the main event, Sting and Jake Roberts match, kind of made that one a disappointment, unfortunately, but I still did like the build-up to that match, and Jake, you know, the ending also wasn't that great with Jake kind of like putting the Cobra on himself to bite him. It didn't look great, unfortunately, so all that hype that I had going into the match, and it kind of was like, you know, whatever, but there were some good things, like Ricky Steamboat and Brian Pillman having a match, a nice odd pairing that you wouldn't expect to see. That was a really good match. And the tag title bout that went to the time limit draw was also definitely worth a look, so be sure to check that out. So the 1992 event, I think there was a lot of promise for it, maybe a little clumsy in the execution, but they had a really great concept there, and I wish they had done Spin the Wheel, Make the Deal more often because it was really cool. And at number 6, we have 1990s Halloween Havoc. Now, WCW was kind of in this weird phase where they were phasing away from the NWA and into WCW as the definitive brand. And the 1990 product compared to the 1989 product is almost night and day. Because it was, aside from Sting winning the title, there's a clear decline in quality from one year to the next. But I did think that the 1990 Halloween Havoc event was overall pretty good. The main storyline was Sting taking on the Black Scorpion, but fortunately they didn't conclude it at this pay-per-view, so we kind of got spared that, at least a little bit. We got spared the match, which they saved that for Starrcade, but the main event we did get was Sid versus Sting, which had a bit of a head-scratcher of a finish and very confusing, where Sting almost got screwed out of the title by Sid pinning an imposter and things like that. It was very confusing, but outside of my problems with maybe the main event storylines, one thing about this show that stands out to me is how god-awful that ring was. So ugly looking. The colors they chose, I think they were going for Halloween-themed colors, but it looked hideous. In future Halloween Havocs, you'd have a graveyard set or a big pumpkin on the set, and that looked really cool. Much better than this, where they just painted the ring like this ugly, gaudy, I don't know, shit brown mixed in with pumpkin orange that just looked terrible. It was like that ring on that show is a gigantic eyesore. However, there were some really good matches on this show, namely from the tag team division. The Steiner Brothers and the Nasty Boys had an awesome match on this show that is definitely worth a look. And we also got Doom taking on the Horsemen, Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, in another really, really good matchup. So you got some good matches here. The overall presentation wasn't bad. It's just, man, that ring is ugly, and the closer to the main event could have been better, unfortunately. But there is some stuff to enjoy in the 1990 event. And at number 5, we have Halloween Havoc 1998. Now, Halloween Havoc 1998 is one that I've already talked about. I did a What Went Wrong video about the Halloween Havoc event from that year. And I to summarize what I said in that video, on paper, this could have been or should have been the greatest pay-per-view in WCW history when you look at You had Goldberg and DDP in the main event, the first pure WCW main event since the formation of the NWO. You had Kevin Nash taking on Scott Hall, the Battle of the Outsiders. You had Bret Hart taking on Sting, a dream match, especially for me, who's a big fan of both guys. You had Hulk Hogan taking on the Ultimate Warrior in a rematch from one of the greatest WrestleMania main events of all time. You had the Steiner brothers colliding, and all these other things going on. On paper, this should have been amazing. The execution left some stuff to be desired, namely the Hogan Warrior match, which has been designated, rightfully so, as one of the worst matches in wrestling history. Definitely, I mean, it's a strong contender for worst match in WCW history. It's that bad. Really, really, really bad stuff. The Outsiders match had a confusing finish. The Bret and Sting match didn't live up to expectations, unfortunately, and it was a sign that there were dents in the armor for WCW at a period when they were red hot. That said, there were plenty of things on here that I did enjoy. The Jericho versus Raven match was quite good. Nice showcase for two talents that were maybe underutilized by WCW, maybe underappreciated, and they got to show off what they could do in a nice little match. The Cruiserweight matches on the show were pretty good. The tag title situation with the Steiner brothers I thought was very, very well handled, where they gave us the Steiner versus Steiner match by pitting them in a tag team match first, and I thought all of that came off really, really well, and was one of the major highlights of the show. Then we had the main event, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, because famously, the pay-per-view feed cut for much of the paying audience, and they didn't get to see the DDP Goldberg match, and they had to give it away for free the next night on Nitro, which is, another example of WCW having egg on their face. But it's a shame, too, because Goldberg and DDP was an awesome match, awesome main event. I'll go as far, I did a top 10 Halloween Havoc match list, and I listed this as the best match in Halloween Havoc history. Unbelievably good match that features one of my favorite counters in the history of wrestling. Great, outstanding stuff that deserves all the praise that it gets all these years later, and it really showed what you could do with Goldberg in the right situations with the right guy, and what DDP really was as a worker. A very underrated worker, I think, and for him to have that kind of a match with Goldberg at that stage really says a lot about him and his ability and his effort, because he was outstanding. And I thought this match was outstanding, and I think it's worthy, like I said, it's worthy of all the praise that it gets. And I think there's enough good on this show to elevate it on this list higher into the top 5 at least, although it should be, I mean, when you look at the rest of the Halloween Havocs and you look at this one on paper, I feel like this one should have been a strong contender for 1 or 2 on this list, and it fell short of that, which is unfortunate. And at number 4, we have Halloween Havoc 1989. Now, the first Halloween Havoc event happened in 1989, a very strong year for the NWA, becoming WCW. It had, the Steamboat Flair trilogy, the Flair and Funk feud, and the rise of Sting into a main event player. So there was a lot of good stuff and a lot of stuff to enjoy in 1989. I don't think the first Halloween Havoc represents the best of what that company was offering in 1989, but it does serve as a very nice time capsule of what the product was like back then due to the amount of star power that's included on it. The Luger-Pillman match for the U.S. title is definitely worth a watch. A great contrast of styles between two individuals that I have a lot of respect for. And if you love tag team wrestling, then this show definitely has you covered, because you have the Samoan SWAT team taking on the Midnight Express. That was the opening match. You had the Freebirds taking on the Dynamic Dudes, which is fun if you hate the Dynamic Dudes. And that was the tag title match of all things. But it's always fun to make fun of them. God, they sucked. And you had Doom taking on the Steiner brothers in a very good, very fun, hard-hitting match. And there was also the Road Warriors taking on the Skyscrapers in a fun brawl. So there were a lot of great tag matches on the show. And if you like tag team wrestling, I think this is one of those shows. Go check it out. I think you'll enjoy it for that. And then in the main event, you had the Thunderdome with Ric Flair and Sting taking on Terry Funk and the Great Muta, with Bruno Sammartino as the guest referee. So I think the Thunderdome itself is one of those concepts that was kind of like a precursor to Hell in a Cell, and maybe wasn't fully realized yet, but it was like a step in the evolution to get to Hell in a Cell. And I thought the match was fun. Again, it was star-studded, it was exciting, and it was a fun main event for the very first Halloween Havoc. And it kind of painted the picture that Halloween Havoc was going to have a lot of gimmicks on it moving forward. But for a first event in a history of an annual event, I think the 1989 Halloween Havoc is a really good show that is definitely worth checking out. Three, we have 1996's Halloween Havoc. Now, this is a show that I reviewed in full a few years ago. I don't remember what year exactly, but I did review this show, and I talked about how much I enjoyed this show going back on the rewatch, and I think it's a bit of a hidden gem in WCW's history. Top to bottom, it is a really well-booked show with all of the matches either delivering or making sense for furthering a story, whether that be Outsiders taking on Harlem Heat for the tag titles, DDP versus Eddie Guerrero, Six Pack versus Chris Jericho, Lex Luger versus Arn Anderson, The Giant versus Jarrett, which was a surprisingly good match, and Rey Mysterio taking on Dean Malenko in another entry in their series of Cruiserweight Championship matches. They all work, and they're all exciting for one reason or another, and the Rey Malenko match, of course, was a very exciting opener. And then you got the Hogan Savage main event, which is nowhere near as good as their WrestleMania 5 match, but an excellent example of what a great heel Hogan could be, where he was just acting like an asshole the entire time, and it worked. That was when he had the fake hair and everything. I think he was working the Three Ninjas movie at that point, so he just went into this match with the hairpiece that he wore for that movie, and it was hilarious. And he came out of that situation with the title, so it was another, oh god, the NWO won again. But then it ended with one of the most exciting moments WCW offered during this time period, and that was the WCW debut of Rowdy Roddy Piper, a truly excellent note to end the pay-per-view on that perfectly set the stage for the Hogan-Piper match at Starrcade just a couple of months later. So that made Halloween Havoc a memorable event, and like I said, top to bottom, I thoroughly enjoyed this pay-per-view. If I have anything to knock it for, I think it's, in a weird way, it doesn't really fit the personality of Halloween Havoc. There were no crazy gimmicks, there were no like cartoonish Halloween-y things on it, except for maybe the set. It didn't feel as much like Halloween Havoc as events that came before it or events that came after it. So it just kind of felt like a standard WCW pay-per-view during that time, albeit a very enjoyable one. So, I don't know, maybe if they had thrown the WCW Halloween Phantom or Chamber of Horrors match in there, I'd probably think, oh yeah, that's a Halloween Havoc event. But as is, I think it is a very enjoyable show and definitely worth a look. Number 2, we have 1997's Halloween Havoc. Now, this was at the point where WCW was at its peak. Creatively, financially, I mean, WCW was firing on all cylinders at this point and was delivering just one of the most exciting wrestling shows you could imagine. But WWF was nipping at their heels, and I think that's important. 97 and 98 were two very exciting years. For those of you who didn't live through it, trust me, 97, 98, two of the best years to be a wrestling fan because you had two excellent products. But in any case, this show is unfortunately kind of remembered for its main event, which was bad. The Hogan-Piper cage match, which Jim Cornette famously derided on Monday Night Raw in one of those famous shoot segments that he did. And it doesn't help that this pay-per-view happened the exact same month as the Undertaker-Shawn Hell in a Cell match, one of the best matches in company history. And it's like, man, just night and day when you look at these two pay-per-view cage matches that close pay-per-views. But what I will say for this pay-per-view, I think the undercard is one of the best that WCW ever put together. But one thing I wish they had done with the main event, first of all, I don't think they should have done Hogan and Piper in a cage. It didn't work, and, you know, Piper was very limited, and Hogan wasn't exactly in shape to carry him to anything. But if they were going to do this match, I would have liked an appearance from Sting to kind of add some flavor to it. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but them's the breaks. But this show does have two of my favorite matches in WCW history, and how many pay-per-views can you say have, like, two of the best matches for a company on one show? Rey Mysterio versus Eddie Guerrero in a mask versus title match, which many consider to be the greatest Cruiserweight Championship match of all time, and I'm in that camp. I think it's an excellent one. and the conclusion to the Randy Savage DDP feud, at least their pay-per-view matches, in the Las Vegas Sudden Death match, which is essentially a last man standing match, or a Texas Death match, whichever one you want to call it. Excellent, hard-hitting, brutal match that took full advantage of the Halloween set that they were using, with them hitting each other with tombstones and other fun stuff like that. Miss Elizabeth got involved. It was a wild match that perfectly encapsulated how exciting and how great that rivalry was. I'll go as far to say it might have been the last great match of Randy Savage's career, and definitely a major highlight on this pay-per-view. So you got those two excellent matches right there, which are enough to elevate this pay-per-view above the failings of its closing match. The undercard also served up some stories for later, like Ric Flair getting revenge on Hennig, which unfortunately was supposed to set up a steel cage match at Starrcade. That didn't happen. Very unfortunate. But it also furthered Larry Zbyszko's issues with Scott Hall, which carried him into Starrcade, his match with Bischoff, and his match with Scott Hall at Sold Out 98. I think at this point, WCW, they were kind of cooking big time, and they were really building towards that Starrcade 97 show, which is kind of why I wish they had done something more with Sting in the closing match. But be that as it may, things were still red hot for WCW at this point. They were heading into their biggest show of all time, which of course didn't deliver, but hey, them's the breaks. I think Halloween Havoc 97, except for the main event, I think perfectly showcases why WCW was such an exciting product during this time, because there was a lot of really good stuff on this show. My pick for the greatest Halloween Havoc event of all time is 1993, the second and final event to use the spin the wheel, make the deal gimmick. And this one executed it much better, as the main event was Cactus Jack selecting from the wheel a Texas death match to battle his rival Big Van Vader. Now, they had done the whole angle where Vader powerbombed him on concrete and he lost his memory and he escaped from a mental hospital and all that other stuff, which some people thought was stupid. I kind of liked it. I thought it was kind of that fun wrestling nuttiness. And it was actually that angle that made me start to appreciate Mick Foley as a talent, because I really got invested in him during that time as Cactus Jack, as the character. And then I watched this main event and it blew me away how violent it was. I had seen blood in wrestling matches before. The first time I remember seeing blood was the Hogan Bossman cage match. Not the Saturday Night's Main Event one, but the one from MSG that's on some of the VHS tapes. The one that didn't have Zeus in it, we'll say that. But it was I think to those early 80s or those late 80s bloodbaths that I had seen, and it's like, oh wow, there's blood. Oh, this one's getting intense. And then I see something like Vader and Cactus Jack, and it blew me away. It's like, I didn't know wrestling could get this violent. It was like, wow, this is wild. Now, the match has been surpassed many times since then, but I think for me as a fan who's growing in my knowledge of wrestling, to see something like kind of push the boundaries on how violent things could get, was very exciting for me at this point. I was 8 years old at the time, and I was becoming a bloodthirsty little monster. So to see Cactus Jack and Vader have a match like this really blew me away. And I think a much better execution of the spin the wheel, make the deal gimmick. And I really wish they had kept it around and made it an annual event, because that would have been really cool. Like, could you imagine 94? If they just had, instead of hyping it up to be a cage match, it's like Hogan and Flair, both careers on the line. Hogan spins the wheel and it lands on a steel cage match. Like, that would have been wild to have that on pay-per-view. But in any case, there are other things to enjoy on this show. You get Lord Steven Regal, William Regal, to most WWF fans, taking on the British Bulldog in a TV title match that was pretty damn good. You got two of my favorite talents from the 80s, Ricky Steamboat and Paul Orndorff, taking each other on in the opening match, which was pretty good. You got Dustin Rhodes versus Steve Austin, reliable as always, battling each other for the US title. And we also get a battle of the Ricks, as Ric Flair and Rick Rude battled each other for the international title. This was that weird period where they had two world titles, because of the whole situation where Flair left the company with a belt and then it, became the international title upon its return. And very confusing, and is the earliest example of having two world titles, and I was utterly confused by it. But in any case, you did get Ric Flair versus Rick Rude. Not the best match in the world, but still just getting it was kind of neat. And a great match. Again, give some credit to Sid. Sting versus Sid was a really, really good match that showcased both men at their best, and you didn't get the screwy finish that you got at 1990, and you got a really, really good match here that, again, showed off Sid as a monster, showed off Sting as the athletic underdog superhero that could come back and beat him. All really, really good stuff. So I think if I had to pick a favorite Halloween Havoc event, I would probably go for this one because it had the Halloween Havoc flavor, it had the spin the wheel, make the deal gimmick, and it executed it well with a great main event. And then the undercard was mostly pretty good. So I think 1993 is a year that most people don't look back on too fondly for wrestling in general. But Halloween Havoc 93, pretty damn good show, and one that really knocked my socks off when I was a kid. And I have a lot of fond memories of it. And I was very happy to see on this most recent rewatch, I was still entertained by it. So if I had to pick a best Halloween Havoc, it would be 1993. And that is all I have for you today. Hopefully you all enjoyed this, and hopefully you all feel compelled to go back and watch some of the old Halloween Havoc shows in preparation for Halloween. I hope you all have a happy Halloween. Enjoy all of the spookiness and all of the fun and all the candy that comes along with this great, great holiday. That is all I have for you now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I will see you all later.